Hi, everyone. By the way, it's very hard to be on the stage because the room is too wide and it's very hard to see everyone and it's too close. So excuse me if I'm not able to see everyone in one shot. So my presentation is actually not a great fit for this, kind of cloud native Kubernetes, but there was a cancellation in the program due to sickness and I was slotted here. So my name is Ibrahim Haddad. I am the Vice President of Strategic Programs at the Linux Foundation. I focus on AI and data projects. I manage in that capacity the LF and Data Foundation and the PyTorch Foundation. And my presentation today is focused really around building open source strategies for organizations. So today, whatever you've started your day, however you started your day, however you came here, you have actually interacted with open source software. Open source software on your phone, in your car, if you logged into the web, if you use the internet, in your smart appliances. So every single one of us today have used open source software. And there are really multiple opportunities created by open source software, and Kubernetes is one of them. That's the previous two presentations. So it is everywhere, it's ubiquitous, and it's extremely important for organizations today to be very involved in the open source ecosystem as a way to leverage and increase their competencies and increase their innovation. So from an open source perspective to a business, it's really about the bottom line. With organizations and enterprises, we've heard from Justin in AWS, they're relying a lot of open source. Kubernetes is one of the components. We have later presentations from Google. All these large corporations, they don't use and incorporate open source in their products and services because it's fun, because their developers like it. They do it because it gives them a certain competitive advantage, okay? And this is the whole key. So from an enterprise perspective, open source is a market accelerant. It offers us a number of advantages that are in relation to faster time to market, a lot of cumulative innovation from the networking effect, having so many people from different organizations contributing and building software together, and several more advantages. However, this is not the topic of the talk today. What's really important to remember is that open source has a very strategic impact on your organization, whether you're using it or not. And the key question is, how can I, as an organization, whether I'm a really large enterprise like Google and IBM and Hitachi and NEC, or I'm a very small startup, how can I take open source and use it to my advantage to help me build products faster, better, and cheaper? And there are actually two specific ways open source can help with that. The first one is what I refer to as direct enablement, and this is how open source directly enables your product and service, where you can implement functionalities in the open source project, where you can contribute internal code that was created by your developers to the open source community, and by supporting the open source project with its compliance activities or legal compliance activities. The second part is what is referred to as indirect enablement, meaning as part of your activities with open source, you get these additional benefits. For instance, when you get involved with the open source project, you are actually stabilizing the project. So you're adding more contributors to it. So there's more activities, there's more discussions, there's more code coming into the project, and all of that stabilizes the project and make it kind of easy, smooth in terms of development activities and internal activities within the project. You participate in policy discussions. There are a lot of discussions in the project about the roadmap, about the features, about future endeavor with the project, and all of that is actually kind of a side effect of being actively involved in the project. You influence the upstream projects by participating in them. So being active in discussions on the mailing list, on Slack, or any other feature discussion with the project is actually extremely important. And all of that put together, it allows companies to use open source software and build better products and services. So when you think of the innovation pipeline as an organization, a lot of organizations work with academia, with universities. They have their own investments in different organizations and startups. There's a startup community And actually outside the hall, there's like hundreds of these organizations. They get involved with corporate VC and many other aspects. And open source is just one of these areas that allows you to accelerate innovation. So if you think of a toolbox, if you have a toolbox, open source is one of these different tools that allows your organization to accelerate innovation, similar to other tools that you use as an organization. And from a business model perspective, there are a lot of flexibility with open source because, as the slide illustrates, you can build open source software directly, you can build with open source software, you can build on top of open source software, and you can build for the purpose of open sourcing. So there are really a lot of flexibility given by the open source licenses on how you can use the software, open source software, and for what purpose. So there is no restrictions from that perspective. So how do open source journey for enterprises look like? Typically, organizations start as a consumer. They start using open source code. Developers in any given organization, they see something online, they pick it up, they try it, they test it, they like it, they start incorporating it. And this is the starting point of any company using open source, is to adopt. So they start consuming open source, and eventually, with time, they start participating with the open source community, then they elevate their participation to becoming a contributor, and then the last step in that journey is to become a leader. And typically it takes organizations years really to move from just a basic consumer, somebody who goes and uses open source code, to all the way to become a leader in any given community. So it's a multi-year journey. So mastering open source software in general, for an organization to become extremely good in open source software, they need to have 4 areas they need to focus on. The first one is consumption and compliance. So basically, an organization needs to be very good at using open source and adapting it for its product and services, and consuming it. As part of that is complying with the licenses. So when you use open source software, let's say under the Apache license, and then you include that Apache license code in your product, you need to be in compliance with the license of the Apache terms. So you have to have planning and different compliance activities so that your organization meets the license obligations you've used. And typically, for example, when I worked at Samsung Electronics, Samsung Research, we used to have over 800 open source components on the Galaxy device. So that means we have 800 different compliance issues we need to deal with, so that when we ship the device, we don't have any legal issues with open source licenses. So for a small company dealing with dozens of open source projects, this can be a minor effort. But for large organizations, we're talking about hundreds and thousands of open source components. The second aspect of mastering open source is in relation to contribution. How can you as an organization be a superb and very efficient contributor to open source project? And how can you ensure that your contributions are being accepted with very less leeward to them? So this is the second area. The third area of mastering open source is in relation to participation. How can you participate very effectively and have your voice heard in open source communities? And the fourth aspect is to reach the leadership position. When you will look back 15 and 20 years, and we see early companies that started with open source, like IBM, for instance, and Intel and others, in 2000, IBM announced they are investing $1 billion in Linux. And $1 billion in year 2000 is a lot more than like $1 billion today, right? So these companies didn't really have a lot of back information and back knowledge to look at. So today we have the advantage that we can look back to other successful companies in that ecosystem and learn from them and see where they made mistakes and avoid these mistakes, and see where they did very good and adopt their practices. So our journey as a company in that ecosystem can be very successful. And typically companies transition from consumer to participant to contributor, and there is an overlap, right? So you can be using open source software and you start contributing a little bit, but you're still using. And then at some point you increase your contribution, but you're still using. So there's really an overlap across these different phases. And it comes down really to these things you see on the screen, kind of the core elements. You know, the compliance, the consumption, the contribution, and the aspect of community. So the previous two speakers, they mentioned about, you know, going online, get some help, you know, talk to other people using that technology and read up the documentation and so on. So there's hundreds and thousands of people behind these different projects, and this is a community really that helps each other. So when you become leader in open source or as part of your journey to become a leader, being very connected to the community is extremely, extremely important. So where do you start? You start by developing your open source strategy, which is basically figuring out what do you want to do as an organization with open source, what are your objectives, what are the opportunities you want to reap from an open source participation, and identify where you are today on that scale. You know, are you a consumer, are you a contributor, or, you know, in between, right? So there's an exercise that I always recommend for organization, which is try to identify what open source you're using today in your organization. And in most companies, they're actually surprised because they're always using more than they think they are, right? So one of the exercises I always do in any given company is check the bill of material of all the products we have. You know, what is the open source software we're using in all products, in all services, and compile that list and try to identify what are the critical components that if these open source projects disappeared basically from planet Earth, would I still be able to continue building my products and services? And if the answer is no, then these projects are critical to me and I have to invest and put resources in them to make sure that they continue to live and prosper so I can still continue using them in my products and services. So the first phase is open source consumption. This is basically the starting point. This is where engineers download and start relying on building with open source software. And you, as a company, as an organization, you need to have certain elements within your company to organize this use. So if you are a small startup of 10 people, most likely you're sitting in one room in a big kind of open space and you talk to each other. And you may not need an infrastructure to handle the consumption. But if you're a large company of hundreds or thousands of employees, or if you are kind of a massive company like, you know, the previous speakers, like, you know, if you're at Amazon, you have thousands of employees in different countries, you cannot just rely on people talking to each other. You need to have a certain infrastructure put in place that organizes the use of open source within your company. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but basically there's a whole set of elements that needs to be implemented. And these elements are in relation to strategy, to policies and processes. So basically the policy defines what can be done and what cannot be done, and the process implements the policy. So the process makes sure that the policy implementation is there and that there is a mechanic for it to work. There's a lot of different things that can be done on the development side, basically integrating open source compliance, for instance, as part of your development roadmap. A lot of education, training employees, implementing tools to make all the process as automated as possible, and getting involved with different organizations such as the Linux Foundation with respect to the different technologies you're working with. You know, the previous speakers were talking about Kubernetes. The Linux Foundation is the host of Kubernetes, so to have the best interaction with the community, it's really a great idea to get involved with the foundation. So now that you're a user, the next step is being an open source participant, and this is where you educate your employees on how to interact with the open source community via Slack, via mailing list, on GitHub issues. So there's a whole lot of different things that you can do to start that dialogue with the community. Because in the previous step, you're just downloading, trying things out and deploying them. But now you want to go one step further, which is talk with the creators of the software, the community that's creating that software, and interact with them and understand where they're going with the software so that you can accommodate your internal development roadmaps. So the third step after that is the contribution. So now you're using the software, you're very familiar with it, you've had some basic interaction with the community, and you want to elevate your participation to a contributor. So you start understanding, you know, where there are bugs, try to create patches and submit them, where there are improvements that you can do to the software, either new features or improvement of existing features, and all of that requires an infrastructure internally to the company. You don't want just any employee to go and give code and without any kind of checks around that. So what organizations typically do is there's a policy for contributing open source projects. There's a process that automates that approval process, if you wish. And there are different sets of educational material that organizations give their employee. For instance, here are the rules to contribute to open source. Here are the different metrics we should pay attention to. Here are some guidelines with respect to legal compliance, et cetera, et cetera. And in many organizations, there's even a dedicated group of people who's focused just on that. And in many companies, it is called OSPO, Open Source Program Office. So if you Google OSPO, you're going to come up with a lot of different hits. And it's basically organizations establishing a program management office dedicated to managing open source within that whole organization. And that includes using open source, contributing to open source, any legal issues, and involvement with Open Source Foundation. So the last step is attaining a certain leadership position. So now when we think of Google, if you work in software and somebody say they work at Google or at IBM or Intel or Qualcomm or any of these companies, you always think, oh, this company is very active in open source. So there's this direct correlation between the company name and open source. Why? Because they've been involved in open source for such a long time, and they've been contributing, launching new projects, and creating new technologies. And organizations aim to get to a leadership position because it gives them a certain advantage in the project and the technologies they participate in. So, in terms of challenges, getting to a leadership position or getting involved with open source, starting contributing and moving to kind of advanced positions, there are always challenges. Like anything, there's different challenges that you need to attain, whether it's in life, whether it's in universities, in school, and at work, and same thing with open source. Now, specifically with open source, there are 5 core challenges that need to be addressed by organizations as they go through that journey and aim for a leadership position. These challenges are in relation to culture, adjusting the internal culture to a more collaborative approach of working. Second set of challenges is in relation to processes. There's a lot of different policies and processes that needs to be implemented to support the use and contribution of open source. And as part of that, there's a lot of tooling that needs to be put in place. You don't want to go back to the Stone Age of employees filling out forms in Excel and sending it by email to some other employees, getting approval, and so you want to automate that as much as possible. And that creates the challenge of tooling, where there are a lot of tools that needs to be set up and installed within the organization, and different workflows defined so that all these different processes you will be creating, it will be all automated, it will be very transparent, and it will not pose any distraction for anyone working on open source. The fourth challenge is in relation to continuity, and that's continuity of strategy. So for instance, if the leadership changes in an organization, what happened to the open source strategy? If funding sources changes, or funding amounts for the open source activities changes. So there are a lot of different challenges in relation to making sure that the effort continues year over year, despite different management changes and business strategy changes. And the fifth last challenge is in relation to education. As my previous 2 colleagues talked about, documentation and learning and going online and educating, there's also a set of education that needs to be done internally within the organization. That include training the engineers on legal compliance, training engineers on how to work with open source projects and communities, training managers how to evaluate engineers working on open source project, and even training the executives in the company to understand this kind of whole new ecosystem of billions of dollars worth of technologies and projects that is available to them to use in building their company. So there are a lot of recommended practices. So I mentioned IBM earlier, but if we look back to early 2000, there are hundreds of companies that embarked on this journey and have really excelled in a phenomenal way with open source. So when we look at their journey, there are a lot of lessons that we can learn and we can take and we can apply to our organization. So there are 15 of them that I list here. I'm not going to go through them one by one, but basically the idea is if somebody went through a journey and I'm about to embark on the same journey, it's very wise of me to go and see, what did they do, how did they do it, what were the wrong steps they've done and avoid them, and learn on all the good moves they've done and go and replicate them for my own organization. So as part of kind of trends and what we see coming today and in the future, there's an increased demand for open source talent. You're probably aware of this. If you're a manager or your organization is hiring open source developers, it's extremely hard to find very skilled developers. They're in high demand. And for each one of these trends, I have some links that you can explore for further reading material. There's the rise of open source program offices. What that means is a lot of organizations today are establishing program offices that are responsible for everything in relation to open source within the organization. There's a to-do group, which is the Linux Foundation efforts that brings in organizations that have open source program offices to exchange ideas, practices, tools, and kind of collaborate together on innovating in this space. In general, there's a higher emphasis on software security, and that also applies to open source. So at the Linux Foundation, we've launched the Open Source Software Security Foundation to provide funding to increase software security in open source projects. I would highly encourage you to visit the Open Source Software Security Foundation if security is part of your kind of job responsibilities. There's a lot of focus on software supply chain. So as you know, with open source software, I can create a software, put it online, give it an open source license, and then hundreds and maybe thousands, if the project becomes successful, thousands of people will be contributing to it, and that software will be moving hands a lot. So we need to figure out, who's contributing, where's that package moving, who's adding what to it, and this is kind of the supply chain, similar to, let's say, if you go to the supermarket and you buy tomatoes, that tomato had a farmer who grew it, and then it went to the first wholesale vendor, second wholesale vendor, and et cetera, till they get to the store. So we need to figure out the whole supply chain of software, and that has also security implications. There's a lot of efforts on increasing AI and infusing AI and machine learning in products and services. And this is a trend, you see outside a lot of actually organizations focused on AI and machine learning. And at the Linux Foundation, we've started the LF AI and Data Foundation, which is an organization that focuses on supporting open source AI and data projects to drive innovation and collaboration. And as of today, we are hosting 41 projects, and we're growing by one project every month. So if you're working on AI, I would highly encourage you to visit the link and figure out how you can get involved with us. And by the way, when I say involved with us, there are no fees. It's all free. And then the last couple areas are in relation to AI, ethical AI. How can we, as an organization, use AI in a very ethical way? And in correlation with AI, kind of tracking data. As you know, AI and data are very correlated. You need a lot of data to train AI models, and having data without models is pretty useless. And with respect to data, we need to figure out where is this data coming from, how is it governed, what are the licenses, how is it managed. So there are a lot of challenges, especially with respect to security and privacy. So there are a lot of efforts, a lot of startup organization, a lot of academic research, a lot of grants being offered by different governments across the globe in an effort to clarify these efforts, these questions, and figure out solutions and kind of practical projects to help with these different areas. So a lot of my talk today was based on a free book that is available online. If you'd like to download it, there's even a Chinese version for those in here. I see a few people smiling. So it's a free download that you can go and grab online. So thank you very much for your time. We have about 3-4 minutes if there are any questions. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.